Winter came early to Blackwood Convent in 1876, settling over its ancient stones like a shroud. The wind carried more than cold through those corridors. It carried secrets, whispered through cracks in mortar, that had witnessed centuries of devotion and despair. Sister Margaret pressed her quill against parchment, her chronicle trembling beneath candlelight. How does one begin to record the impossible? How does one document a disappearance that defies every law of God and nature? She closed her eyes, remembering that first glimpse of Eliza Thorn. The girl had arrived on a December morning when frost painted the windows like tears frozen in descent. 19 years old, though she carried herself with the weight of someone who had lived far longer. Her luggage was meager: a single trunk, a worn Bible, and eyes that held depths Margaret had never seen in a postulant. There was something haunted in Eliza's gaze, as if she had already seen her own ending. Mother Superior Agatha received her with the cold efficiency that governed all aspects of life at Blackwood. "You come to us broken," she declared, her voice echoing through the stone receiving chamber. "We shall make you whole, or we shall break you further, until nothing remains but devotion." Eliza's response was barely audible. "I fear I am already nothing, Mother." The convent itself seemed to recoil from her presence. Built in the 13th century, Blackwood rose from Yorkshire moorland like a prayer carved in stone, but it was a prayer tinged with darkness. Its walls had absorbed generations of suffering, each stone a repository of tears shed in silence. The Gothic arches stretched toward heaven, but their shadows fell deep into earth that had never known true peace. Margaret watched Eliza navigate those first weeks with growing unease. The girl attended prayers with mechanical precision, her lips moving in rhythm with ancient hymns, yet her eyes remained elsewhere, focused on something beyond the veil of the visible world. She ate little, slept less, and when she spoke at all, it was in fragments that made no sense. "The bell remembers," Eliza whispered one evening during Vespers, her words barely audible above the chorus of voices. "It remembers everything." Margaret glanced toward the bell tower, visible through the chapel's stained glass windows. The great bell had not rung in decades, its ropes severed and mechanism sealed, after an incident the older nuns refused to discuss. Yet Eliza stared at it with recognition, as if greeting an old friend. The other sisters began to notice. They spoke in hushed tones about Eliza's nightly wanderings, how she would leave her cell after Compline and walk the corridors until dawn. Sister Agnes claimed to have seen her standing in the cloister garden, motionless as a statue, her face turned toward the tower. Sister Catherine swore she heard weeping from Eliza's cell at all hours, though the girl's eyes remained perpetually dry. "She communes with shadows," whispered Sister Bernadette, the oldest among them. "I have seen her type before. They come to us not for salvation, but because they are already claimed." Mother Superior's response was swift and merciless. Eliza's wanderings were curtailed through stricter supervision, her meals reduced to bread and water, her prayer time extended until her knees bled from kneeling on stone, yet none of it touched whatever darkness had taken root in her soul. Margaret found herself drawn to the girl despite her better judgment. There was something in Eliza's suffering that resonated with her own hidden doubts, her own questions about the nature of faith and the price of devotion. She began to watch more carefully, to document what others dismissed as madness. 3 weeks before Eliza's disappearance, Margaret observed her standing before the sealed door to the bell tower. The girl's hands were pressed against the ancient wood, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or incantation. When Margaret approached, Eliza turned with tears streaming down her face. "Can you hear them, sister?" she asked, her voice hollow as winter wind. "Can you hear them calling?" Margaret listened but heard only silence. Yet something in that silence felt wrong, as if it were not absence but presence, a held breath, a pause between heartbeats that stretched too long. 2 weeks later, Eliza spoke her final recorded words to Margaret during their evening meal. "The stone remembers what we forget, and what we forget, we are doomed to repeat." The next morning she was gone. Her cell showed no signs of struggle, no indication of departure. Her few possessions remained untouched, her bed unslept, her prayer book open to Psalm 130. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. The only evidence of her existence was a small journal hidden beneath her straw mattress. A journal Margaret would not discover for several days when the official search had ended and the matter declared closed. Mother Superior's proclamation was swift and final. Eliza Thorn has been called home by our Lord. We shall not question his wisdom, nor shall we speak of this matter again. Let us pray for her soul and trust in divine justice. But Margaret knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that whatever had claimed Eliza Thorn was not divine. It was something older, hungrier, and it dwelt within the very stones of Blackwood Convent. As she sat in her cell that night, listening to the wind howl through corridors that suddenly felt too vast and too empty, Margaret could not escape one terrible question. If Eliza Thorn had truly vanished without a trace, then why could she still hear in the deepest hours of night the sound of weeping that seemed to rise from the very foundations of their sacred home? The morning after Eliza's disappearance brought no relief to Blackwood Convent, only a silence that felt heavier than any sound. Margaret moved through her daily obligations like a sleepwalker, her mind consumed by the terrible absence that seemed to echo through every corridor. The other sisters responded to Eliza's vanishing in ways that revealed more about their characters than years of shared prayer ever had. Sister Agnes developed a nervous tremor in her hands, constantly fingering her rosary beads until they clicked like chattering teeth. Sister Catherine began checking and rechecking the locks on doors that had stood open for decades. Sister Bernadette, ancient as the stones themselves, simply nodded as if she had expected this outcome all along. But it was the younger nuns who disturbed Margaret most. They whispered when they thought no one was listening, their voices carrying fragments of speculation that chilled the blood. She was taken for her sins, hissed Sister Lucia during morning prayers. The Lord removes those who bring corruption to holy ground. I saw her shadow in the chapel last night, whispered Sister Mary during their communal meal, standing at the altar as if she had never left. The bell tower, murmured Sister Frances, her eyes wide with remembered terror. I heard movement up there after matins, footsteps where no feet should tread. Margaret documented each rumor, each whispered confession, in her private chronicle. As the convent's official chronicler, she was tasked with recording significant events, but this was the first time she had documented something that officially had never happened. Mother Superior's edict was clear. Eliza Thorn's disappearance was divine will, not to be questioned or recorded. Yet the very stones of Blackwood seemed to rebel against this imposed silence. Doors that had remained closed for years were found standing open each morning despite being secured the night before. The ancient hinges groaned with movement no living hand had caused. Sister Catherine, whose cell was nearest to the sealed archives, reported the sound of pages turning in the night, though the archives had been locked since before her arrival at the convent. The chapel, too, began to exhibit strange behaviors. Candles that had been extinguished after evening prayers were discovered burning at dawn, their wax pooled in patterns that suggested they had burned throughout the night. The altar cloth, laundered and pressed each week, bore stains that appeared overnight, not wine or oil, but something darker that no amount of washing could remove. Most disturbing of all were the hymns. It began as a whisper, barely audible above the wind that constantly howled through Blackwood's corridors. Sister Margaret first heard it during the deep hours of night, when even the most devout slept fitfully. A woman's voice singing, Veni Creator Spiritus in Latin, so perfectly it might have been angelic, if not for the sorrow that suffused every note. Margaret crept from her cell to investigate, her bare feet silent on stones worn smooth by centuries of passage. The singing seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the walls themselves. She followed the sound through the cloister, past the refectory, toward the chapel. but as she approached, the voice faded like mist before dawn. Other sisters began to report similar experiences. Sister Agnes claimed to hear the dies array sung in the early hours before lauds. Sister Catherine swore she recognized the voice of Eliza Thorn herself, though she admitted this in such terrified whispers that Margaret could barely make out the words. On the fourth night after Eliza's disappearance, Margaret's investigation took a more concrete turn. Unable to sleep, tormented by questions that multiplied like shadows, she decided to search Eliza's former cell more thoroughly. Mother Superior had declared the room closed to all, but Margaret's position as chronicler granted her certain privileges, and she was willing to risk divine wrath for earthly truth. The cell was exactly as Eliza had left it. The narrow bed with its thin mattress and coarse blanket, the wooden cross mounted on the wall, its surface worn smooth by countless fingers seeking comfort. The small window that offered a view of the bell tower, its glass thick with frost that never seemed to melt. Margaret began her search methodically, running her hands along the stone walls, checking for loose mortar or hidden recesses. She examined the few possessions Eliza had left behind, a worn Bible with passages underlined in fading ink, a wooden comb missing several teeth, a small mirror whose surface was clouded with age. It was while lifting the mattress to check beneath it that Margaret's fingers encountered something unexpected, a small bound journal, its leather cover soft with handling. Her heart racing, she carried it to the window where moonlight provided just enough illumination to read. The journal's early entries were mundane. Records of daily prayers, observations about convent life, reflections on scripture. But as Margaret read deeper, Eliza's writing became increasingly erratic. Words were crossed out, lines blotted with ink, or what might have been tears. The handwriting itself grew wild, as if written in haste or fear. One entry, dated just a week before Eliza's disappearance, made Margaret's blood freeze. The dreams come every night. Now I see children playing in the cloister, where no children have walked for generations. I smell blood in the chapel during morning mass, though no sacrifice has been made. And always, always, the figure in grey robe stands beside my bed, watching with eyes that hold no mercy. The bell calls to me, though it has not rung in decades. I know I must answer. I know I must climb those forbidden stairs and face whatever waits in the tower. The stone remembers, and through me, it speaks. God forgive me. I think I am already dead. Margaret's hands shook as she closed the journal. The implications were staggering. Not just that Eliza had experienced supernatural encounters, but that she had somehow been chosen for whatever fate had claimed her. The reference to children particularly disturbed Margaret, as no child had resided at Blackwood in living memory. As she prepared to leave the cell, Margaret noticed something she had missed before. The small mirror on Eliza's table was not merely clouded with age. There were fingerprints on its surface, fresh ones, as if someone had recently pressed their hands against the glass from the inside. That night, Margaret's dreams were filled with the sound of weeping that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the convent. She saw Eliza standing in the bell tower, her face pale as moonlight, her lips moving in words Margaret could not hear but somehow understood. I tried to warn you, I tried to tell you the truth. But the stone remembers, and it is hungry still. When Margaret woke, she found dirt beneath her fingernails, though she had not left her cell all night. And somewhere in the distance, carrying on wind that tasted of sorrow and secrets, she heard the sound of a bell that could not ring. The mystery was no longer about one girl's disappearance. It was about something far older and more terrible, something that dwelt within Blackwood's walls and fed on innocence itself. Margaret realized with growing dread that Eliza Thorn had not simply vanished. She had been consumed by a hunger that had waited centuries for its next meal. And Margaret feared she knew who that meal would be. In the pale light of dawn, Margaret sat in her cell with Eliza's journal spread before her like a map to damnation. Each page revealed new horrors. Each entry peeled back another layer of the terrible truth that festered within Blackwood's ancient walls. The journal spanned 3 months, from Eliza's arrival in December to her final entry, dated just 2 days before her disappearance. What began as the ordinary reflections of a young woman seeking God became something far more sinister, the documentation of a soul's descent into a darkness that predated Christianity itself. Margaret read with growing horror as Eliza's neat script devolved into desperate scrawls, her careful theological observations replaced by fragments of nightmare and prophecy. January 15th. The dreams grow stronger. Last night I walked through corridors that do not exist, guided by lantern light that cast no shadows. I saw them. The others who came before me. Young women in habits of different centuries, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and understanding. They tried to warn me in languages I do not speak, yet somehow comprehend. I wake each morning with the taste of earth in my mouth and dirt beneath my fingernails, though I have not left my cell. Something calls to me from beneath the stones, and I fear I am beginning to answer. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned the page. Eliza's handwriting became increasingly erratic, punctuated by ink blots and what appeared to be tear stains. January 28th. Sister Agnes knows. I see it in her eyes during prayers, the way she watches me with a mixture of pity and terror. When I asked her about the bell tower, she began to weep and would not speak for hours. Some doors, she finally whispered, are sealed for good reason. But the door calls to me. I hear it in the wood's grain, in the rust of its ancient hinges. It speaks of things buried and forgotten, of sacrifices made to appease hunger that have no name. The entries continued, each more disturbing than the last. Eliza wrote of seeing apparitions in the chapel, children who played among the pews when no one was watching, their laughter echoing from stone that had absorbed centuries of sorrow. She described the scent of decay that followed her through the corridors, growing stronger as she approached the sealed tower. Most unsettling were her accounts of nocturnal visitors. The figure in grey robes appeared nightly, standing at the foot of her bed with outstretched hands that dripped with something that might have been water or blood. February 10th. It spoke to me last night. The voice was like wind through broken glass, carrying words in a tongue older than Latin. I understood none of it, yet its meaning seared itself into my soul. The stone remembers. The stone hungers. The stone chooses. I am chosen. I have always been chosen. From the moment I first saw Blackwood rising from the moor, I knew I was coming home to die. Margaret set the journal aside, her stomach churning with nausea and dread. She moved to her small window, desperate for air that did not taste of ancient secrets. But even the winter wind carried whispers now, fragments of words in languages she did not recognize, yet somehow understood in the deepest part of her soul. When she returned to the journal, the final entries made her blood freeze. February 20th. I found them today, beneath the altar in the chapel, hidden behind stones that have not been moved in generations, names carved into the foundation itself. Mary Ashworth, 1654, Catherine Brennan, 1701, Elizabeth Hartwell, 1739. Dozens of them spanning centuries, all young, all forgotten. The bell remembers their names even when God forgets. I understand now why the tower is sealed. It is not to keep us out, it is to keep something in. But something grows hungry, and hunger finds a way. The penultimate entry was barely legible, the ink smeared as if written in great haste. February 22nd. It comes from me tonight. I can feel it in the stones beneath my feet, in the air that grows thick with anticipation. The other sisters sense it too. I see them watching me with the eyes of mourners at a funeral that has not yet begun. Mother Superior knows. She has always known. This place was not built for worship, but for feeding. The grey figure whispers truths that make my soul weep. We are not postulants seeking God. We are offerings to something that wears his face but bears his opposite nature. If someone finds this, know that I go willingly into darkness, not from despair but from understanding. The cycle must be broken, but I am not strong enough to break it. Perhaps another will be. The bell tolls for me, though no living hand pulls its rope. I must answer. I must climb those forbidden stairs and face whatever waits in the darkness above. God help me. I want to climb them. The final entry consisted of only a few words, written in handwriting so shaky it was barely recognizable as Eliza's. It is beautiful. It is terrible. I am hungry. The stone remembers. Margaret closed the journal with hands that shook uncontrollably. The implications were staggering, not just that Eliza had experienced supernatural encounters, but that Blackwood Convent itself was built upon something ancient and malevolent. The references to names carved beneath the altar, to centuries of disappeared women, painted a picture of systematic sacrifice disguised as divine mystery. But most terrifying was the realization that Eliza had gone to her fate willingly, not from madness but from some terrible understanding that Margaret was only beginning to grasp. She thought of Mother Superior's swift dismissal of Eliza's disappearance, her insistence that the matter was closed and not to be discussed. She thought of Sister Agnes's trembling hands and knowing looks. She thought of the way the older nuns watched her now, with the same expression Eliza had described seeing in their eyes. Margaret rose from her chair and moved to her small mirror, studying her own reflection with new eyes. At 19, she was the same age Eliza had been. She had come to Blackwood seeking purpose and finding only questions. Like Eliza, she was drawn to mysteries others preferred to ignore. As she stared at her reflection, Margaret could swear she saw something move behind her, a figure in grey robes with outstretched hands. But when she turned, the cell was empty save for shadows that seemed too deep for the meager light they contained. That night, for the first time since taking her vows, Margaret did not kneel for evening prayers. Instead, she sat by her window and watched the bell tower, waiting for movement that logic said could not come. The journal lay open beside her, its final pages filled with warnings she was only beginning to understand. Somewhere in the darkness above, beyond sealed doors and rusted chains, something ancient stirred in response to her vigil. The stone remembered, just as Eliza had written, and Margaret feared it was remembering her. 3 days after discovering Eliza's journal, Margaret could no longer resist the call that seemed to emanate from the sealed tower. It pulled at her with the same inexorable force that draws iron to lodestone. Reason be damned. The bell tower rose from Blackwood's northeast corner like a stone finger pointing accusingly at heaven. 4 stories of weathered granite, its windows long since bricked over, save for thin slits that allowed only the thinnest slivers of light to penetrate its interior darkness. The door at its base had been sealed with iron bands and chains that showed the rust of decades, yet Margaret had noticed recently that the rust appeared disturbed, as if the chains had been moved and replaced. She waited until the deepest hours of night, when even the most devout sisters slept, and the corridors held only shadows for company, armed with a single candle, and Eliza's journal pressed against her heart like a talisman. Margaret made her way through passages that seemed to whisper warnings with every step. The tower door stood before her like a monument to forbidden knowledge. Up close, she could see that her suspicions were correct. The chains showed fresh scratches beneath their patina of age, and the heavy iron lock bore the marks of recent use. Someone had been here before her, someone with keys that should not exist. Margaret pressed her ear against the ancient wood, listening for any sound from within. What she heard made her soul recoil. Breathing that was not quite human, a rhythmic inhalation and exhalation that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. And beneath that, barely audible, the sound of movement, footsteps ascending stairs that should have held no living feet. The lock, to her amazement, was not secured. The chain fell away at her touch, as if it had been waiting for her arrival. The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo through every corridor of the convent, yet when Margaret glanced back toward the dormitories, no lights appeared at windows, no concerned voices called out. It was as if the sound existed only for her. The stench that greeted her was overwhelming decay and mold, but beneath that something else. Something metallic and sweet that made her think of blood left too long in stagnant air. Margaret lifted her candle, its weak flame barely penetrating the darkness that seemed to press against her like a living thing. The tower's base was a circular chamber, perhaps 20 feet across, its walls lined with stones that wept moisture, despite the winter cold. Ancient ropes hung from a mechanism far above, the pulleys that once rang the great bell now silent and still. But it was not the mechanical aspects of the chamber that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. Carved into the walls at heights, suggesting they had been made by someone tall or standing on elevated ground, were names, dozens of them, spanning what appeared to be centuries. The carving was crude but deep, as if made with desperate urgency by hands that shook with fear or ecstasy. Margaret moved closer, raising her candle to illuminate the grim roll call. Mary Ashworth, 1654. The first name Eliza had mentioned in her journal. Catherine Brennan, 1701. Elizabeth Hartwell, 1739. Each name was accompanied by a date, and Margaret realized with growing horror that the dates corresponded to disappearances that had been forgotten, written off as divine calling or natural departure. But it was not the historical names that made her legs nearly give way. There, carved with fresh precision into stone still bearing dust from recent work, was a name that stopped her heart, Eliza Thorn, 1876. And below it, in letters that seemed to glow with malevolent purpose in the candlelight, was another name entirely, Margaret Whitmore, 1876. Her own name, carved as if by hands that knew her fate before she did. Margaret stumbled backward, her candle flame wavering with her trembling hand. The chamber seemed to spin around her, the names on the walls blurring into a tapestry of forgotten souls. But as her panic subsided, replaced by the cold clarity that comes with terror acknowledged and accepted, she noticed something else. The names were arranged in a pattern, not chronologically, but by some other design. Those from earlier centuries were carved higher on the walls, while more recent names descended toward the chamber's floor. And at the very bottom, almost hidden by shadows and debris, were symbols that predated any Christian presence in these lands. Pagan markings, Celtic spirals intertwined with symbols she did not recognize, but which filled her with primal dread. Whatever had claimed these women were older than the convent, older than Christianity itself. Blackwood had not been built to contain this evil. It had been built to feed it. A sound from above made Margaret look up, her candle casting dancing shadows on the stone ceiling. Footsteps on the stairs she had not yet dared to climb, descending with measured purpose. Someone or something was coming down to meet her. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The footsteps continued their descent, growing closer with each measured beat. But what terrified her most was not their approach, it was their familiarity. She had heard that particular cadence before, in the corridors of the convent during Eliza's final weeks. A figure emerged from the stairwell, and Margaret's sanity nearly shattered. It was Eliza Thorn, yet not Eliza. The girl's face was pale as parchment, her eyes reflecting Margaret's candlelight like coins at the bottom of a well. She wore the same habit she had vanished in, but it was now stained with substances Margaret preferred not to identify. "You came," Eliza said, her voice carrying the echo of great distances. "I knew you would. The stone called to you as it called to me." Margaret found her voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "Eliza, is it truly you?" The thing that wore Eliza's face smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "I am what remains when flesh surrenders to purpose. I am the echo that lingers when the song has ended." She gestured toward the walls with their catalogue of names. "We are all here, sister, all of us who answered the call." "What is this place?" Margaret managed to ask, though part of her already knew the answer would damn her soul. "This is the heart," Eliza replied, moving closer with steps that made no sound on the stone floor. "The hunger beneath all hunger. The convent feeds it, and has fed it for centuries, and in return, it grants us purpose beyond the flesh." Margaret noticed that where Eliza walked, the stones themselves seemed to darken, as if her presence drained light from the very material of the world. "You're dead," Margaret whispered. "Death is transformation," Eliza corrected. "I have become something greater than flesh, something eternal. And you, dear Margaret, have been chosen to join us." The carved names on the walls seemed to pulse with malevolent life, each one a soul trapped in service to whatever ancient evil dwelt beneath Blackwood's foundations. Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that she stood at the threshold of the same fate that had claimed generations of young women before her. But unlike those who had come before, Margaret carried something they had not, the knowledge of the cycle, documented in Eliza's journal, and now confirmed by her own investigation. For the first time in centuries, the prey understood the nature of the trap. As Eliza reached out with hands that dripped with moisture from the spaces between worlds, Margaret made a choice that would echo through the remaining chapters of this terrible story. She would not go gently into the darkness that had claimed so many others. She would fight, and if she could not save herself, perhaps she could save those who might come after. The candle flame flickered as if responding to her resolve, and somewhere far above, the great bell that had not rung in decades gave a single resonant toll that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. Margaret fled the tower with Eliza's words echoing in her ears like a funeral dirge. The vision of her own name carved in stone burned into her mind's eye. But even as terror drove her through Blackwood's corridors, a terrible understanding began to crystallize. Eliza's appearance had not been mere supernatural manifestation. It had been a warning disguised as threat, a desperate attempt by whatever remained of the girl's soul to illuminate the pattern that trapped them all. The next morning brought no relief, only the suffocating normalcy of convent life layered over horrors that defied comprehension. Margaret attended prayers with lips that moved in familiar Latin, while her mind raced through implications that threatened to shatter her sanity. Around her, the other sisters maintained their usual devotions, yet she noticed subtle changes, the way Sister Agnes's eyes darted constantly toward the tower window, how Sister Catherine crossed herself whenever she passed Eliza's former cell. They knew. Perhaps they had always known. After morning prayers, Margaret made her way to the convent's archives, a cramped chamber beneath the refectory, where centuries of records molded in blessed darkness. If other women had vanished throughout Blackwood's history, there would be documentation, carefully worded perhaps, but present nonetheless. The archives smelled of decay and forgotten prayers, their shelves lined with volumes bound in leather that had cracked with age. Margaret pulled record after record, her candle casting dancing shadows on pages that chronicled the mundane details of monastic life, until she began to notice the absences. The pattern emerged like stars appearing at dusk. Every few decades, sometimes closer together, there would be a gap in the records. A postulant would be mentioned in one entry, then never again. The explanations varied. Divine calling, return to family, mysterious illness. But the result was always the same. Young women, usually within their first year at Blackwood, simply ceased to exist in the official record. Margaret documented each disappearance, her hands growing steadier as the evidence mounted. Mary Ashworth, listed as having received a calling to serve in distant lands in 1654. Catherine Brennan, noted as having returned to her father's house in 1701, though Margaret found a later addendum mentioning that Catherine's family had never received word of her departure from Blackwood. The deceptions were careful but not perfect. Whoever had maintained these records over the centuries had been human, prone to inconsistency and small mistakes that revealed the truth beneath official fiction. By midday, Margaret had identified 17 documented disappearances spanning 2 centuries, and she suspected there were more in records too damaged to read. But it was in the archive's deepest recesses, among documents so old their parchment crumbled at her touch, that Margaret found the most damning evidence. A collection of letters bound with cord that had rotted to threads, their contents barely legible but comprehensible enough to confirm her darkest suspicions. The first letter, dated 1623, was addressed to the Bishop of York from one Father Benedict Ashworth, likely a relative of Mary Ashworth, who had vanished decades later. The priest wrote of disturbing reports from parishioners near Blackwood, claims of strange lights in the tower windows, and voices heard singing in languages that predated Christian presence in the region. The local populace speaks of pagan rites conducted within the convent walls. Father Ashworth had written, "While I place little credence in such superstitions, I feel compelled to report that several families have lost daughters who sought refuge at Blackwood, only to vanish as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole." The bishop's response, attached to the original letter, was tersely dismissive. The work at Blackwood is of vital importance to the Church's mission in these lands. You will discourage further speculation among your parishioners and trust that God's servants act according to his greater plan. Margaret's blood chilled as she realized the implications. The church hierarchy had been aware of the disappearances for centuries, but had chosen to ignore them, or perhaps had actively concealed them. Blackwood was not merely a convent harboring ancient evil, it was an institution protected by powers that reached far beyond its walls. A sound from above made her freeze, the heavy tread of boots descending toward the archives. Margaret quickly gathered the documents she had been reading, stuffing them beneath her habit, just as Mother Superior Agatha appeared at the chamber's entrance. "Sister Margaret," the older woman said, her voice carrying the cold authority that had governed Blackwood for decades. "You spend considerable time among these dusty records. Perhaps your spiritual energies would be better directed toward prayer." Margaret forced herself to meet the Mother Superior's gaze, though what she saw there made her soul recoil. Agatha's eyes held knowledge, terrible, ancient knowledge, and behind that knowledge, a satisfaction that spoke of plans fulfilled and purposes served. "I find great solace in contemplating the history of our order, Mother," Margaret replied, her voice steadier than she had dared hope. "The archives contain inspiring accounts of faith rewarded." "Indeed they do," Agatha agreed, but her smile held no warmth. "Faith rewarded, and disobedience punished. Tell me, child, have you given thought to your future here at Blackwood, to the nature of the calling that brought you to our walls?" The question was casual, but Margaret heard the threat beneath it. "I trust in God's plan for my life, Mother, as do we all. But sometimes God's plan requires sacrifices that test our understanding." Agatha moved closer, her presence filling the small chamber like smoke from a poisoned fire. The young often mistake curiosity for piety, seeking answers to questions that are best left unasked. Margaret felt the stolen documents burning against her skin like brands of accusation. "I seek only to serve God and our order, Mother." "Service requires obedience," Agatha said, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to echo from the stones themselves. "And obedience requires acceptance of mysteries that transcend mortal comprehension. Some doors, child, are sealed for the protection of those too weak to bear what lies beyond." With that warning delivered, Mother Superior swept from the archives, leaving Margaret alone with shadows that seemed to press closer in her absence. But even in her terror, Margaret recognized something crucial. Agatha's words had been a confession, disguised as threat. The Mother Superior knew exactly what dwelt within Blackwood's walls, and she served it willingly. That night Margaret lay in her cell and read through the documents she had stolen, their contents illuminating a conspiracy that spanned centuries. The pattern was clear. Blackwood Convent existed not to serve God, but to serve something far older and infinitely more hungry. The young women who disappeared were not random victims but carefully selected offerings, chosen according to criteria that had been refined over generations of ritualized murder. As she contemplated the full scope of the horror that surrounded her, Margaret realized she faced a choice that would define not only her fate, but potentially the fate of future victims. She could accept the role that had been prepared for her, joining the ranks of the disappeared in whatever form that existence took. Or she could fight, not just for her own survival, but to break a cycle that had claimed too many innocent souls. Outside her window, the bell tower stood silhouetted against stars that seemed colder than usual, their light failing to penetrate the darkness that clung to Blackwood's ancient stones. And in that darkness, Margaret could swear she saw figures moving, the shades of all those who had come before, watching to see whether she would have the courage to succeed where they had failed. The stone remembered, as Eliza had written, but perhaps, Margaret thought as she clutched the evidence against her chest, it was time for the stone to learn what it meant to forget. Margaret knew she could not face the evil within Blackwood alone. The weight of centuries pressed against her investigation like water against a dam, threatening to drown her in secrets too vast for one soul to bear. Salvation, if it existed at all, would require an ally, someone whose faith had not yet been corrupted by the terrible knowledge that festered within the convent's walls. Brother Thomas arrived at Blackwood on a Tuesday morning in early March, sent by the parish to assist with confessions during the Lenten season. He was young, perhaps 25, with the earnest demeanor of a man who still believed in the fundamental goodness of God's servants. Margaret watched him from across the chapel during morning prayers, noting how his eyes took in the convent's Gothic architecture with genuine reverence rather than the wary recognition she had learned to associate with longer residence at Blackwood. Here was someone who had not yet learned to fear the shadows. Margaret's opportunity came 3 days after Thomas's arrival, when she approached him after evening confessions. The chapel was empty, save for lingering incense and the weight of sins acknowledged but not absolved, for how could God absolve what he had never sanctioned? "Brother Thomas," she began, her voice carefully modulated to suggest routine inquiry rather than desperate conspiracy. "I wonder if I might discuss a matter of spiritual concern with you." He turned from the altar where he had been arranging his confession materials, his face open and attentive. "Of course, sister. What troubles your conscience?" Margaret glanced around the chapel, noting the way shadows seemed to cluster in corners where candles should have banished them. "Perhaps we might speak in private. This matter requires discretion." Something in her tone made Thomas pause, his pastoral instinct sensing depths beneath her careful words. "Certainly. Shall we adjourn to the sacristy?" The sacristy offered marginally more privacy, though Margaret had learned to distrust any space within Blackwood's walls. She began carefully, testing Thomas's responses as she revealed fragments of her investigation. "Brother, in your experience, have you encountered unusual phenomena among the faithful, manifestations that might be attributed to supernatural influences?" Thomas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I have heard confession from many troubled souls, sister. Sometimes guilt can manifest in ways that seem otherworldly to those who bear it. Are you concerned about someone in particular?" Margaret took a breath, knowing that her next words would either gain her an ally or expose her to betrayal. "What if I told you that this convent harbors secrets that predate its Christian foundation? That young women have disappeared here for centuries, their fates concealed by those sworn to protect them." The change in Thomas's expression was immediate and gratifying. Gone was the patient condescension she had learned to expect from the clergy, replaced by sharp attention and growing alarm. "That would be a grave accusation," he said carefully. "What evidence supports such a claim?" Margaret produced the document she had stolen from the archives, watching Thomas's face as he read Father Ashworth's centuries-old warnings and the bishop's dismissive response. She showed him her catalogue of disappearances, the pattern of young women erased from official records, with explanations that crumbled under scrutiny. "My God," Thomas whispered as the implications became clear. "How long has this been happening?" "Centuries," Margaret replied, "and I fear I am intended to be the next victim." She told him about Eliza Thorn's journal, about the names carved in the tower walls, about her encounter with something wearing Eliza's face. Thomas listened with growing horror, his faith struggling to accommodate truths that challenged everything he had been taught about the sanctity of religious institutions. "We must inform the authorities," he said, when Margaret finished her account. "The church hierarchy, the civil magistrates." "With what proof?" Margaret interrupted. "Documents that could be dismissed as forgeries. Testimony about supernatural encounters that would mark us both as mad. The church has known about this for generations, brother. Their silence is complicated." Thomas stared at the evidence spread between them, his worldview cracking like ice in spring. "Then what do you propose we do?" "We investigate further," Margaret said. "We document everything we can find, gathering evidence so overwhelming that it cannot be dismissed or concealed. And we discover the source of this evil, what lies beneath Blackwood, that demands such terrible feeding." Over the following days, Thomas proved himself a valuable ally. His position as visiting clergy granted him access to areas of the convent that were forbidden to the sisters, and his theological training helped him recognize the significance of symbols and practices that Margaret might have overlooked. It was Thomas who first noticed the anomalies in the chapel's construction. While examining the altar during his preparation for Mass, he discovered that the stone platform was not solid but hollow, its interior accessible through panels so cunningly concealed that only careful observation revealed their existence. "Sister," he whispered to Margaret during a clandestine meeting in the sacristy, "I believe there are chambers beneath the chapel. The altar itself is merely the entrance to something larger." That night, they descended into spaces that had not seen light for decades. Thomas's lantern revealed a network of tunnels carved from living rock, their walls bearing symbols that made both investigators' skin crawl. These were not Christian catacombs, but something far older, pagan burial chambers repurposed for rituals that had nothing to do with salvation. The tunnels branched and twisted like veins through Blackwood's foundations, but all paths eventually led to a central chamber that took their breath away. Here was the true heart of the convent's evil. A circular room perhaps 30 feet across, its ceiling supported by pillars carved with spirals and symbols that seemed to writhe in the lantern light. At the chamber's center stood an altar that was unmistakably pagan in origin, a massive stone slab stained with substances that had seeped so deeply into the rock that no amount of cleaning could remove them. Around the altar's base were arranged items that spoke of centuries of ritualized murder, bones polished smooth by handling, chalices that reeked of corruption, and implements whose purpose Margaret preferred not to contemplate. But it was the walls that revealed the full scope of the horror. Here, carved with far greater skill than the crude names in the tower, was a complete record of the sacrifices. Not just names and dates, but detailed depictions of the rituals themselves. Young women bound and bleeding while figures in religious garb offered their lives to entities that had no place in any Christian cosmology. "This is not merely murder," Thomas said, his voice hollow with recognition. "This is systematic sacrifice to something that feeds on innocence itself." Margaret nodded, her archaeological training helping her interpret what they had discovered. The convent was built atop a pre-existing pagan site. The early Christians didn't consecrate this ground. They continued the old practices under new names. The disappeared women aren't victims of random evil. They're offerings to whatever dwells in these depths. As if summoned by her words, a sound echoed through the chamber, breathing that came from the stones themselves, deep and rhythmic like the respiration of some vast entity in eternal slumber. The temperature dropped perceptibly, and both investigators watched in horror as their breath began to mist in air that had suddenly become arctic. Something was awakening. something that had fed on centuries of sacrifice and had grown hungry for its next meal. Margaret and Thomas fled the catacombs, their minds reeling with the implications of what they had discovered. Blackwood Convent was not merely harboring evil, it was built to serve it, a carefully maintained feeding system designed to sustain entities that predated human civilization. As they emerged into the chapel above, both knew their investigation had reached a critical threshold. They possessed knowledge that could destroy the conspiracy, but they also knew that such knowledge made them targets. The next phase of their struggle would determine not only their own survival, but the fate of every young woman who might seek sanctuary at Blackwood in years to come. The ancient evil beneath the convent had awakened to their presence, and Margaret feared it was already making plans to add their names to the terrible catalogue, carved in its unholy chambers. The discovery of the catacombs marked a turning point in the supernatural activity that plagued Blackwood Convent. Where before the manifestations had been subtle, whispered voices, moved objects, unexplained shadows, now they erupted with a malevolence that seemed to saturate the very air. Margaret's nights became waking nightmares. She would lie in her narrow cell, listening to footsteps that paced the corridors with military precision, though investigation revealed no living source for the sounds. Doors slammed with enough force to wake the entire dormitory. Yet when the sisters emerged to investigate, they found only empty hallways and air that tasted of grave earth. The other nuns responded to the escalating phenomena with behaviors that revealed their individual relationships with the convent's secret nature. Sister Agnes began speaking in tongues during prayers, her words in languages that predated Latin by millennia. Sister Catherine was found each morning kneeling in her cell, surrounded by candles she swore she had not lit. Their wax pooled in patterns that hurt the eyes to contemplate. Most disturbing was Sister Bernadette, the eldest among them. The ancient nun began to smile during the most terrifying manifestations, her face radiant with an expression that suggested not fear but anticipation. When Margaret passed her in the corridors, Bernadette would whisper fragments in her ear, "Soon, child, soon the waiting ends." But it was the appearances of Eliza Thorn that pushed Margaret's sanity to its breaking point. The first sighting occurred during matins, when Margaret glanced toward the chapel's side altar and saw Eliza kneeling there in perfect mimicry of prayer. The figure was translucent, visible through the morning light that streamed through stained glass windows, yet undeniably present. When Margaret blinked, Eliza was gone, leaving only the scent of earth and corruption. The encounters grew more frequent and more intimate. Margaret would return to her cell to find Eliza sitting on her bed, her pale hands folded in her lap and her eyes reflecting candlelight like mirrors at the bottom of wells. The apparition never spoke during these visits, but her presence communicated volumes, sorrow, warning, and a desperate urgency that made Margaret's heart race with sympathetic terror. "She's trying to tell me something," Margaret confided to Brother Thomas during one of their clandestine meetings, "but I fear understanding what that something might be." Thomas had his own encounters to report. During his preparation for morning mass, he would often find the altar rearranged in configurations that bore no resemblance to Christian tradition. Candles would be positioned in pentagram patterns, religious artifacts arranged to form symbols that belonged to far older faiths. When he questioned the other sisters about these changes, they claimed no knowledge, but their eyes held secrets they refused to share. The manifestations reached their crescendo on the night Margaret attempted to return to the bell tower, armed with renewed determination and Thomas's borrowed courage. She had planned to examine the carved names more carefully, to search for clues that might reveal the pattern governing the selections. She never made it past the tower's entrance. As Margaret approached the sealed door, she found it standing open despite the chains and locks that should have secured it. Beyond the threshold, the circular chamber blazed with light that had no visible source, its stone walls glowing with an inner radiance that cast no shadows. And in the center of that impossible illumination stood Eliza Thorn. But this was not the translucent shade Margaret had glimpsed in the chapel and cell. This Eliza possessed substance and presence, her form solid enough to disturb the dust motes that danced in the spectral light. She wore her familiar habit, but it was clean now, pristine as the day she had first donned it. Her face, too, was different, not the pallid visage of the dead, but radiant with an inner light that spoke of transcendence achieved through terrible sacrifice. "You understand now," Eliza said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from the stones themselves. "You have seen what lies beneath, what feeds on innocence and calls it holy." Margaret found her voice, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "What are you?" "I am what remains when flesh surrenders to purpose greater than itself," Eliza replied, moving closer with steps that made no sound on the stone floor. "I am the bridge between what was and what must be. And you, dear Margaret, are the key to ending what should never have begun." The carved names on the walls began to glow with the same inner light that surrounded Eliza, each one pulsing like a heartbeat. Margaret realized with dawning horror that she was witnessing not just supernatural manifestation but active communication, the accumulated voices of centuries crying out for justice that had been too long denied. "How many?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "More than the walls can hold," Eliza replied. "The names you see are only those who resisted, who died clinging to fragments of their souls. The others," she gestured toward the floor, and Margaret saw that the stones beneath her feet were carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the impossible light. The others became part of the foundation itself, their essence absorbed into the very fabric of this cursed place. Margaret's legs nearly gave way as the full scope of the atrocity became clear. Blackwood was not merely built atop a site of ancient sacrifice. It was constructed from the spiritual remains of its victims, their souls bound into the mortar and stone to serve the entity that dwelt in the depths below. "The cycle must be broken," Eliza continued, her form beginning to fade as if the effort of manifestation was exhausting her remaining essence. "But breaking it requires sacrifice of a different kind, not of innocence, but of complicity. The truth must be revealed, no matter the cost." As the light faded and Eliza's presence dissolved back into shadow, Margaret was left with a final whispered warning. "It comes for you tonight. Be ready." Margaret fled the tower with those words echoing in her ears, her mind racing with the implications of what she had witnessed. The manifestations were not random supernatural events, but coordinated attempts at communication from victims who had transcended death without achieving rest. They were trying to help her, to provide the knowledge necessary to break the cycle that had claimed them. But help came with a price. As Margaret returned to her cell, she found Brother Thomas waiting with news that chilled her blood. Mother Superior had announced that Margaret would undergo a special ceremony the following evening, a spiritual cleansing that would take place in the chapel after the other sisters had retired. Margaret knew without doubt that this ceremony would be her last. The entity that dwelt beneath Blackwood had grown tired of waiting, and Mother Superior had received instructions to complete the harvest that had been interrupted by Margaret's investigation. As she knelt in her cell that night, surrounded by shadows that no longer offered comfort, Margaret realized she faced the same choice that had confronted every woman whose name was carved in the tower walls. She could accept her fate and hope for mercy in whatever form existence took after the ritual's completion, or she could fight, knowing that resistance might doom not only herself, but Brother Thomas and any future victims who might seek sanctuary at Blackwood. Outside her window, the bell tower stood silhouetted against stars that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat. And in that darkness, Margaret could feel the attention of something vast and hungry, counting the hours until its next feeding could begin. The haunting of Blackwood had reached its culmination. Tomorrow would bring either liberation or an end to Margaret's investigation that would ensure the terrible cycle continued unbroken for generations yet to come. The hours before Margaret's ordained ceremony crept by with the agonizing slowness of a condemned prisoner's final day. She maintained the pretense of normalcy, attending prayers and meals with mechanical precision, while her mind raced through possibilities for escape or resistance. But as evening descended upon Blackwood like a funeral shroud, she realized that flight was no longer an option. The convent itself had become her prison. Doors that had stood open for years were now mysteriously locked, their iron mechanisms refusing to yield to any key Margaret possessed. Windows that should have offered routes to the outside world were sealed with bars that appeared overnight, their metal still warm to the touch, as if forged by supernatural heat. Even the chapel, once a sanctuary where she might have claimed the right of asylum, felt hostile and watchful. Mother Superior moved through the final evening with the satisfied efficiency of someone completing long-planned arrangements. She spoke little, but her eyes carried the gleam of anticipation that Margaret had learned to associate with the convent's darkest secrets. During the evening meal, Agatha rose to address the assembled sisters. "Tonight we witness a great blessing," she announced, her voice carrying the ceremonial cadence, reserved for the most sacred occasions. "Sister Margaret has been chosen for a special service to our Lord, a calling that transcends the mundane boundaries of earthly existence." The other nuns responded with expressions that ranged from studied ignorance to knowing complicity. Sister Agnes wept openly, though whether from sorrow or religious ecstasy, Margaret could not determine. Sister Bernadette smiled with the beatific expression of a martyr approaching the flames. Only a few of the younger sisters seemed genuinely confused by the announcement, their faces reflecting the innocence that had once been Margaret's own. As Compline approached, Brother Thomas found a moment to speak with Margaret privately. His face was pale with understanding of what the night would bring, but his voice carried the steady resolve of a man prepared to stand against evil, regardless of the cost. "I have sent word to the bishop," he whispered urgently. "Documentation of everything we discovered, copies of the evidence we gathered. Even if we cannot prevent what happens tonight, the truth will not die with us." Margaret nodded, grateful for his foresight, even as she recognized its limitations. The church hierarchy had protected Blackwood's secrets for centuries. They would not suddenly develop conscience when confronted with evidence that implicated their own complicity. "There is another way," she replied, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had wrestled with terrible knowledge and emerged with desperate clarity. "If the cycle is to be broken, it must be broken from within. The entity that feeds here draws its power from willing sacrifice, from victims who surrender their souls in hope of divine reward. But what if a sacrifice were offered in defiance rather than submission?" Thomas's eyes widened as he grasped her meaning. "I mean to do what Eliza could not," she interrupted. "I mean to turn their own ritual against them, to offer myself not as food for their ancient hunger, but as poison that might finally end their feast." The great bell of Blackwood, silent for decades, chose that moment to toll. Its bronze voice rang out across the moors with such force that every stone in the convent seemed to vibrate in response. But this was impossible. Margaret had seen the severed ropes, the sealed mechanism. No human hand could have set that bell in motion. Yet it tolled again and again, marking midnight with a resonance that seemed to originate not from the tower, but from the very foundations of the earth beneath Blackwood. The sound carried harmonics that human ears were never meant to process, frequencies that bypassed conscious hearing and spoke directly to the primitive terror that dwelt in every mortal soul. Margaret's blood turned to ice. As she realized the significance, the bell tolled not to announce the hour, but to summon the faithful to witness a harvest that had been anticipated for months. Mother Superior appeared at Margaret's cell as the 12th toll faded into silence. Behind her stood Sisters Agnes and Bernadette, their faces grave with ceremonial purpose. In their hands they carried items that belonged to no Christian ritual, chains of tarnished silver, a chalice that reeked of corruption, and robes dyed the color of dried blood. "It is time," Agatha announced, her voice carrying the authority of centuries. The calling you have felt since your arrival here must now be answered." Margaret rose from her bed with the dignity of someone accepting fate while secretly planning rebellion. "I am ready, Mother." The procession through Blackwood's corridors took on the character of a funeral march. Margaret walked surrounded by sisters whose faces reflected various degrees of knowledge about the night's true purpose. Some genuinely believed they were witnessing a divine calling. Others participated with the resigned complicity of those who had made peace with serving evil in exchange for survival. But it was the chapel that revealed the full scope of the horror Margaret was meant to face. The familiar space had been transformed into something that would have made pagan druids weep with recognition. The Christian altar was gone, replaced by the ancient stone slab Margaret had discovered in the catacombs below. Candles arranged in configurations that hurt the eyes to contemplate cast light that seemed to writhe and dance with malevolent life. And around the transformed sanctuary stood figures that made Margaret's sanity real, the shades of every woman who had been sacrificed in this place across the centuries. They were translucent, visible through the candlelight, but undeniably present. Mary Ashworth, Catherine Brennan, Elizabeth Hartwell, dozens of others whose names were carved in the tower above, and at their center, radiant with the terrible beauty of the transcendent dead, stood Eliza Thorn. But these were not the tormented spirits Margaret had encountered before. These were the witnesses, the accumulated consciousness of every soul that had been offered to the thing that dwelt beneath Blackwood. They had come to see whether Margaret would join their eternal servitude or find the strength to break the chains that bound them all. Mother Superior gestured toward the altar with ceremonial precision. "The hunger awakens," she intoned. "The stone remembers. The cycle continues." As Margaret was led toward the ancient slab, she felt the attention of something vast and alien focusing upon her with the intensity of a burning lens. The temperature in the chapel dropped until her breath misted in the suddenly arctic air. The candle flames began to dance and writhe as if stirred by winds that originated in spaces between worlds. But Margaret had not come to this moment unprepared. In her final hours of freedom, she had made preparations that even Mother Superior's supernatural awareness had failed to detect. Hidden within her habit was a vial of oil she had blessed with prayers older than Christianity, words in languages that predated Latin, invocations that called upon powers the Church had tried to forget but could never fully suppress. As the assembled sisters began to chant in harmonies that belonged to no earthly music, Margaret realized the moment of truth had arrived. She could submit to the role that had been prepared for her, adding her name to the catalogue of the consumed, or she could make a different choice, one that might destroy her utterly, but could potentially free every soul that had been trapped in Blackwood's terrible service. The great bell tolled again, its impossible voice shaking dust from rafters that had stood for centuries. And in that bronze resonance, Margaret heard not summons but opportunity, the moment when the barriers between worlds grew thin enough for mortal will to challenge immortal hunger. She stepped toward the altar, not as a victim, but as a warrior, knowing that the battle for Blackwood's soul was about to begin. Margaret approached the ancient altar with the measured steps of someone walking toward either salvation or damnation, knowing that the distinction might prove meaningless in the cosmic scope of what was about to unfold. The assembled sisters continued their unholy chant, their voices weaving harmonies that seemed to resonate from the stones themselves. But Margaret's attention was focused on Mother Superior Agatha, whose face now revealed the terrible truth she had concealed for decades. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable. Where moments before had stood an aging nun whose severity might have been attributed to religious devotion, now Margaret saw something far older and more malevolent. Agatha's eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge gained through centuries of complicity, and her smile revealed teeth that belonged to no human mouth. "You have been chosen," Agatha intoned, her voice carrying harmonics that bypassed conscious hearing and spoke directly to the primitive terror that dwelt in every mortal soul. "As I was chosen." as every Mother Superior of Blackwood has been chosen since the first stones were laid upon this cursed ground. Margaret felt the weight of revelation settle upon her like a burial shroud. "How long?" she whispered. "Since the beginning," Agatha replied, her form beginning to shimmer and shift as if she were not entirely anchored to physical reality. "The Church knew what dwelt here when they built their convent atop pagan foundations. They knew, and they chose to feed it, rather than fight it. Better to control hunger than risk its unleashing upon the world." The implications staggered Margaret's understanding. Not only was Blackwood a feeding ground for ancient evil, but it existed with the full knowledge and consent of the Church hierarchy. Every disappeared woman, every sacrifice, every name carved in the tower, all of it sanctioned by those who claimed to serve God. "The girls who come here," Margaret managed to ask. "They're selected?" "Carefully chosen," Agatha confirmed, moving closer to the altar, where shadows seemed to gather with anticipation. "Young women of particular spiritual sensitivity, those who hear the call of the sacred in ways that make them suitable vessels. The entity beneath requires specific qualities in its offerings. Innocence, yes, but also strength of soul. Weak spirits provide little nourishment." Margaret glanced toward the assembled spirits of the sacrificed, noting how they watched the proceedings with expressions of terrible understanding. They had been strong once, these women who had sought sanctuary at Blackwood, only to find damnation. Their strength had made them desirable prey, and their resistance had made their eventual surrender all the more satisfying to the thing that consumed them. "What is it?" Margaret asked, needing to understand the nature of her enemy. "What dwells beneath this place?" Agatha's laugh was like wind through a charnel house. "Something that existed before your Christ walked the earth, before Rome built its empire, before humans learned to speak the names of gods. The Celts knew it and fed it willingly. The Romans found ways to appease it. The Church," she gestured toward the transformed chapel, with its blasphemous altar and impossible geometry. "The Church made a bargain." The chanting of the assembled sisters reached a crescendo that made the very air vibrate with malevolent purpose. Margaret could feel the attention of the entity focusing upon her with the intensity of a burning lens, its hunger palpable as morning fog, but she also felt something else. The accumulated will of every woman who had died in this place, their spiritual essence lending her strength she had not known she possessed. "You speak of bargains," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized into resolve. "But every bargain can be broken." Brother Thomas chose that moment to make his entrance, bursting through the chapel doors with the desperation of someone attempting to prevent an atrocity. His face was pale with terror and determination as he took in the transformed sanctuary, the assembled spirits, and the altar that reeked of centuries of spilled blood. "Margaret," he called out, his voice cutting through the unholy harmonies like a blade through silk. "You don't have to do this." But even as he spoke, shadows began to pour from the spaces between stones, flowing across the chapel floor like liquid darkness given form and purpose. The entity was awakening fully, roused by the proximity of its intended feast and the interference of an uninvited witness. Mother Superior turned toward Thomas with eyes that now glowed with inner fire. "You have no place here, priest. This is older than your God, stronger than your faith. Return to your prayers and leave us to our sacred work." "Sacred?" Thomas's voice cracked with outrage. "This is an abomination, murder disguised as devotion." The shadows coalesced into a form that defied description, not human yet possessing a terrible intelligence that had observed the rise and fall of civilizations. When it spoke, its voice emerged from every stone in Blackwood simultaneously. "I am the hunger that dwells in sacred places. I am the darkness that gives meaning to light. I am the price of sanctuary in a world that offers none." Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that she stood at the fulcrum of a choice that would determine not only her fate, but the future of every young woman who might seek refuge at Blackwood. The entity offered eternal existence in exchange for spiritual surrender, a bargain that countless others had accepted in their final moments. But Margaret had come prepared for a different kind of sacrifice. From within her habit, she withdrew the vial of blessed oil she had prepared in secret, not with Christian prayers but with invocations far older and more primal. The liquid within had been sanctified by words that predated Latin, consecrated with intentions that reached back to humanity's first attempts to drive back the darkness. "I offer myself," Margaret declared, her voice ringing with the authority of someone who had chosen defiance over submission, "but not as food for your hunger, as poison for your feast." She shattered the vial against the ancient altar, its contents spreading across stone that had absorbed centuries of spilled blood. Where the oil touched, the altar began to smoke and crack, its surface writhing as if in agony. The entity's roar of pain and rage shook every stone in Blackwood's foundation. The assembled spirits of the sacrificed began to glow brighter, their forms becoming more solid as the entity's hold over them weakened, and Mother Superior Agatha screamed as whatever force had sustained her across the decades began to withdraw. "You cannot," she shrieked, her form beginning to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to flame. "The cycle must continue. The hunger must be fed." But Margaret was already moving, pulling the ropes that Brother Thomas had brought, not to bind her for sacrifice, but to trigger the collapse she and Thomas had planned in desperate whispers during their final meeting. The ropes were attached to supports they had weakened in the catacombs below, structural elements whose failure would bring down not just the chapel but the entire tower that crowned Blackwood's evil. As the ropes went taut and the first stones began to fall, Margaret found herself surrounded by the spirits of every woman who had died in this place. But they were no longer prisoners, they were liberators. Their combined will focused on ending the cycle that had claimed them all. Eliza Thorn stepped forward from among the assembled dead, her form blazing with light that belonged to neither heaven nor earth. "The stone remembers," she said, her voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of centuries of suffering. "But now it will learn to forget." The collapse began in earnest as Margaret and Thomas fled toward whatever safety they could find. Behind them, the entity's screams shook the very foundations of reality as its feeding ground was destroyed and its collected harvest of souls broke free from bondage that had lasted centuries. But even as Blackwood Convent crumbled around them, Margaret knew that the true confrontation was yet to come. They had wounded the ancient evil, perhaps mortally, but whether they had truly killed it or merely forced it to seek new hunting grounds remained to be seen. The bell tower fell with a crash that could be heard for miles across the Yorkshire moors, carrying with it the accumulated weight of centuries of secret sin. And in that collapse, Margaret thought she heard something that might have been the sound of chains breaking, or the birth cry of something even more terrible than what they had fought to destroy. Dawn broke over the ruins of Blackwood Convent with a light that seemed hesitant, as if the sun itself questioned whether this ground could ever again know true illumination. Margaret and Brother Thomas stood among the rubble that had once been the bell tower, their clothes torn and their faces streaked with dust from their narrow escape, watching smoke rise from stones that should not have been able to burn. The collapse had been more complete than either had dared hope. Not just the tower, but the entire chapel and most of the dormitory wings lay in ruins, their ancient stones finally surrendering to forces they had channeled for too many centuries. The catacombs beneath were sealed forever under tons of debris, and with them, the altar that had served as a feeding ground for horrors beyond human comprehension. But victory had come at a price that Margaret was only beginning to understand. The other sisters of Blackwood were gone, not fled, but simply absent, as if they had never existed at all. Their cells stood empty, their possessions vanished, even their names erased from records that Thomas found scattered among the debris. It was as if Mother Superior Agatha and her complicit followers had been nothing more than extensions of the entity itself, manifestations that dissolved when their purpose was no longer served. Only Sister Agnes remained, discovered hours after the collapse in the ruins of the refectory, her mind shattered by revelations that mortal consciousness was never meant to bear. She spoke in fragments, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in languages that predated human speech, telling anyone who would listen about the children she had seen playing in corridors where no children should have walked. Margaret knelt beside the older nun, noting how Agnes's eyes held the terrible clarity that comes with truth acknowledged too late. "The children," Agnes whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that howled through Blackwood's broken stones. "They were the first offerings, before the young women, before the carefully selected postulants, children stolen from the moors, their innocence fed to something that had not yet learned to crave more mature souls." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. The entity's hunger had evolved over centuries, its tastes refined by generations of feeding. What had once sustained itself on the simple innocence of children had developed an appetite for the more complex spiritual essence of young women, grappling with faith and doubt. "How many?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Hundreds," Agnes replied, her hands trembling as they traced symbols in the dust that hurt the eyes to follow. "Centuries of them, their bones are in the foundations, their souls bound into the mortar itself. That's why the collapse was so complete. When the entity's power broke, everything built with their essence simply returned to dust." Thomas appeared at Margaret's shoulder, his face grim with news from the outside world. "I've sent word to the church hierarchy," he reported, "but their response suggests they knew this day would come eventually. They're already preparing the official story, a tragic fire that claimed the lives of all residents. There will be no investigation, no inquiry into the true nature of what happened here." Margaret felt the weight of institutional betrayal settle upon her like a shroud, even in defeat. The conspiracy that had protected Blackwood's secret would continue, covering up centuries of complicity with explanations that preserved the church's reputation while erasing the truth. "The survivors," she asked, "what becomes of us?" "New identities," Thomas replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "New assignments far from here. Official silence maintained through transfer and isolation. We are to be living reminders of secrets that must never be spoken." That night, as they sheltered in the ruins of what had once been Blackwood's library, Margaret began the task that would define the remainder of her life. By candlelight, she started writing, not the official chronicle of a religious house, but the true account of what had transpired within these cursed walls. She wrote of Eliza Thorn and her terrible journey into understanding. She documented the names carved in the tower, the evidence hidden in archives, the catacombs that had served as both tomb and temple for an entity that fed on spiritual essence. Every detail was recorded with the precision of someone who knew that truth, once written, could never be entirely suppressed. As she wrote, Margaret became aware that she was not alone. The spirits of the sacrificed women had not departed with the entity's destruction. They lingered still, drawn by her efforts to record their stories. Eliza stood closest, her form no longer translucent but solid enough to cast shadows in the candlelight. "You are writing our names," Eliza said, her voice carrying the peace that comes with justice finally served, "making us real again, giving us existence beyond the darkness that claimed us." "It's the least I can do," Margaret replied, her pen never pausing in its work. "The world should know what happened here, should know the price of the silence that protected this place." "The world will forget," Eliza warned. "They always do. Truth is too heavy a burden for most souls to bear." Margaret looked up from her writing, meeting Eliza's eyes with resolve hardened by all she had witnessed. "Then we must ensure they are reminded, generation after generation, until the truth becomes impossible to ignore." Over the following days, as church officials arrived to oversee the cleanup of Blackwood's ruins, Margaret completed her chronicle. Every page was a testament to lives lost and truths buried, every word a rebellion against the institutional silence that had enabled centuries of horror. When Thomas came to collect her for their mandatory relocation, Margaret pressed the completed chronicle into his hands. "Hide this," she urged. "Keep it safe until the world is ready to hear what really happened here." "And if that day never comes?" Thomas asked. Margaret smiled with the bitter wisdom of someone who had looked into the abyss and chosen to record what she found there. "Then perhaps someone else will find it, just as I found Eliza's journal. Truth has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to bury it." Years later, when Margaret's hair had gone white and her hands trembled with age, she would receive word that workmen renovating an old parish house had discovered a cache of documents hidden within its walls. Among them was her chronicle of Blackwood, its pages preserved despite decades of concealment. The discovery would spark investigations that the church hierarchy could not entirely suppress. Historians would piece together evidence of the conspiracy, journalists would ask uncomfortable questions, and slowly, reluctantly, the truth of what had happened at Blackwood Convent would begin to emerge. But on that final morning among the ruins, as Margaret prepared to leave the only home she had known as an adult, she added one last entry to her chronicle. "The stone remembers what we force ourselves to forget. And though Blackwood Convent lies in ruins, though the entity that fed here has been destroyed or driven back into whatever darkness spawned it, the hunger itself remains. It will seek new feeding grounds, new conspiracies of silence to protect its feast. I pray that those who come after will prove stronger than we were, that they will choose truth over comfort, justice over silence. For in the end, that is all any of us can do, bear witness to the darkness, and trust that someone somewhere will have the courage to kindle light. The stone remembers, and it will hunger again." Margaret closed the chronicle with hands that shook only slightly, sealing within its pages a truth that would outlive empires and endure long after the last stones of Blackwood had crumbled to dust. As she walked away from the ruins for the final time, she carried with her the certainty that her work was complete, not because evil had been permanently defeated, but because its nature had been documented and preserved for those brave enough to continue the fight. Behind her, the wind whistled through broken stones, carrying whispers that might have been the voices of the freed dead offering their gratitude, or the echo of something ancient and hungry, already seeking new ground in which to plant its terrible seeds.